What does it mean when 12 ordinary people, fishermen and tax collectors and men with no particular standing in the world, become the founding voices of one of the largest movements in human history? In 1st century Judea, a small group of individuals gathered around a teacher from Galilee, and in the years after his death spread a message across the Roman world that within 3 centuries had transformed the empire that had executed him. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
The 12 apostles are among the most cited names in Western culture and among the least individually understood. They appear in art, in church dedications, in the names of cities and mountains and feast days, but the actual people behind the names are often reduced to symbols or silhouettes. Tonight, we turn to 12 individuals from the margins of the ancient world and ask what we actually know about who they were, what they did, and why their collective impact became so extraordinary. The question is not only what the apostles believed, but who they were as people, and what it means that history was changed by a group of individuals whose names we know, but whose lives remain only partially visible.
The apostles were not chosen because they were powerful or educated or strategically positioned. They were chosen from among ordinary people engaged in ordinary occupations, and the deliberateness of that choice carried theological and symbolic weight from the beginning. The number 12 was not incidental. It echoed the 12 tribes of Israel, and signaled that what was being established was something with deep roots in Jewish tradition.
We are speaking about the 12 apostles, the individuals at the center of the earliest Christian movement, examined as historical and human figures rather than as symbolic icons.
Much of what we know comes from a combination of the New Testament texts, later church traditions, and historical interpretation. Separating history from belief is not always possible, and in many cases the tradition is all we have. What we can do is examine each figure honestly, acknowledging both what is documented and what remains uncertain.
Then let us begin with the context that made these 12 lives possible, and with the first and most prominent among them.
1st century Judea was a province under Roman occupation, administered through a combination of local client rulers and Roman governors. The population was predominantly Jewish, living under Roman law, while maintaining a distinct religious and cultural identity. The region was politically tense, economically stratified, and religiously complex. Multiple Jewish sects competed for influence: Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, Essenes, and others. It was in this environment that a teacher from Galilee called Jesus began attracting followers. Simon, later called Peter, was a fisherman from Bethsaida near the Sea of Galilee. He was probably not educated in the formal sense. He was impulsive, direct, and capable of both great courage and spectacular failure. The Gospels show him walking on water, and then sinking in fear, confessing Jesus as the Messiah, and then denying him 3 times before the crucifixion. He is perhaps the most fully human of the 12, a figure who repeatedly demonstrates the gap between intention and action.
So Peter's prominence in the tradition comes partly from his failures as much as his strengths.
Yes, and here's the first thing we need to correct about the standard image of the apostle. They are often presented as unwavering and spiritually certain from the beginning. The text presents something different. People who were confused, afraid, doubtful, and frequently wrong in their interpretations of what they were witnessing. Their later transformation into figures of extraordinary commitment is what makes their story compelling. It is not a story of settled saints, but of ordinary people who kept returning despite their own failures. Peter's phrase from the Gospel of John, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life," is a statement made not from certainty, but from the recognition that there is nowhere else to turn. Andrew was Peter's brother, also a fisherman, and according to the Gospel of John, he was the first to be called. His role in the texts is often that of the connector, the one who brings others to meet Jesus. He introduces Peter to Jesus. He brings the boy with the loaves and fish to the attention of the teacher. He is not the most prominent figure, but he is consistently the one who links people together. The tradition that he was later crucified on an X-shaped cross, now called the Cross of St. Andrew, is preserved in Scottish and Russian traditions, and he is the patron saint of both countries. James the Greater, also a fisherman and the brother of John, was part of the inner circle of 3 closest to Jesus, along with Peter and John. He and his brother were nicknamed Boanerges, sons of thunder, reportedly because of their passionate temperament. He asked to sit at the right hand of Jesus in glory, a moment the text present as revealing a misunderstanding of what was actually being offered. He is traditionally regarded as the first of the 12 to be executed. killed by Herod Agrippa around 44 of the Common Era. John, the brother of James, is a more complex figure in the tradition. He appears throughout the Gospel narratives as the disciple whom Jesus loved, a phrase whose significance has been interpreted variously across centuries of scholarship. He is associated in later tradition with the Gospel of John, 3 epistles, and the Book of Revelation, though the historical relationship between the apostle and these texts is debated among scholars. He is the only one of the 12 who, according to most traditions, was not executed for his faith, passing away in old age in Ephesus.
So John stands apart from the others in both his closeness to Jesus and in the manner of his ending.
Yes, Philip appears in the Gospel of John as a questioning figure, someone who consistently seeks clarification. When Jesus says he is the way, the truth and the life, it is Philip who asks to be shown the Father directly. His practical curiosity makes him distinctive. He is associated by later tradition with missionary activity in the region that is now Turkey, and his tomb is believed to have been located in Hierapolis. Bartholomew is often identified with Nathanael, whom Philip brings to Jesus in the Gospel of John. His first response to hearing that something significant has come from Nazareth is to ask whether anything good could come from Nazareth, a skepticism that is corrected almost immediately by direct encounter. His directness and his willingness to update his position when confronted with evidence make him, in a different way, as interesting a figure as Thomas. Tradition places his missionary activity in Armenia and India, and he is the patron saint of Armenia. Matthew was a tax collector, known in the texts as Levi before his calling. This is one of the most socially significant details in the apostolic group. Tax collectors in 1st century Judea were widely regarded as collaborators with Roman occupation and as personally corrupt. They were social outcasts in their own community. Matthew's inclusion in the group was a statement about who the movement was for, and his transformation from a figure of stigma into one of the 12 was presented explicitly as an example of what inclusion actually meant.
So the presence of a tax collector in the group was itself a theological argument.
Yes, Thomas is perhaps the most psychologically accessible of the 12 for a modern reader. After the crucifixion, when the other disciples report having seen the risen Jesus, Thomas is absent and refuses to believe without direct evidence. He states that unless he sees the marks of the nails and puts his hand in the wounds, he will not believe. When Jesus appears to him directly and invites him to examine the evidence, Thomas responds with what may be the most theologically compressed statement in the New Testament. The Gospels present his demand for evidence not as faithlessness but as honesty. James the Less presents one of the genuine historical difficulties in apostolic tradition. The identification of this James is complicated by the presence of multiple people named James in the early Christian texts. He is distinguished from James the Greater, but not always clearly from James the brother of Jesus, who became a leader of the Jerusalem church. The relative obscurity of his individual profile in the texts reflects a broader reality. Not all of the 12 are equally documented, and the tradition has often worked harder to fill gaps than to acknowledge them. Thaddeus, also known as Jude or Judas, son of James, appears in the Gospel of John in one of the most humanly revealing moments in the text. During the Last Supper discourse, when Jesus speaks of revealing himself to those who love him but not to the world, Thaddeus asks directly, "Lord, what has happened that you will reveal yourself to us and not to the world?" It is a question that expresses genuine confusion, and it is the kind of question the tradition remembers precisely because it is the kind of question people actually ask. He is traditionally associated with missionary activity in Armenia and Persia. Simon the Zealot is identified by a designation whose precise meaning is debated. The term zealot may refer to membership in the Zealot movement, a group committed to violent resistance against Roman occupation, or it may simply indicate religious zeal, in a more general sense. If the political interpretation is correct, it is remarkable that Simon and Matthew, a potential resistance fighter and a Roman collaborator, were part of the same group. The apostolic circle would then have contained individuals whose political positions were not merely different but actively opposed.
So the group may have been as diverse politically as it was socially.
Yes. And then there is Judas Iscariot. He is the most famous and the most difficult. The Gospels present him as the treasurer of the group, as someone trusted with practical responsibility, and then as the person who arranged for Jesus to be arrested, in exchange for 30 pieces of silver. The tradition has overwhelmingly treated him as the embodiment of betrayal, but the questions surrounding his motivations, whether he acted from greed, from disillusionment, from a misguided attempt to force a crisis, or from some other impulse that the texts do not fully explain, have never been resolved. The Gospel of John presents Judas as already corrupted, as someone who stole from the common purse. The Gospel of Matthew describes his remorse after the arrest, his attempt to return the money, and his decision to end his own life. These accounts present a more complex picture than simple villainy. What is common to all accounts is that, whatever he intended, the outcome was not what he appears to have expected, and that he did not live to see what his action produced. The first-century Jewish world into which the apostles were born was shaped by centuries of foreign occupation, the memory of independence under the Maccabees, and the ongoing tension between those who accommodated Roman power and those who resisted it. The Temple in Jerusalem was the central religious institution of Jewish life, rebuilt and expanded under Herod the Great into one of the most impressive structures in the ancient world. It was also the site of profound conflict between priestly authority, popular religious movements, and Roman administrative control.
So the apostles were not born into a stable or settled world, but into a society under genuine strain.
Yes, and this context is essential for understanding both why Jesus attracted followers, and why his movement was perceived as threatening by multiple different authorities simultaneously. The Roman administration feared civil unrest. The temple establishment feared the erosion of their authority. The various Jewish renewal movements each saw in Jesus a potential ally or a competitor. The apostles were navigating all of these tensions simultaneously, often without fully understanding them. The question of what the apostles actually understood during the ministry of Jesus is one of the most interesting in the texts. The Gospels repeatedly show them misunderstanding parables, arguing about status, falling asleep in Gethsemane, and fleeing at the arrest. Even in the final days before the crucifixion, the disciples are debating which of them is the greatest. The picture that emerges is of people who were drawn to a teacher they could not fully comprehend, whose message they kept partially missing, and who would only understand what they had witnessed after it was over.
Though understanding came after commitment, rather than before it did.
Yes, and this is part of what makes their story theologically significant within the tradition. They are not presented as having believed because they fully understood. They are presented as having continued in the face of incomprehension, fear, and failure. The tradition does not sanitize their inadequacies. It includes them because the inadequacies are part of the point. The replacement of Judas by Matthias, chosen by Lot after the crucifixion, is itself an instructive moment in the early community. The need to restore the number to 12 before any missionary activity had begun in earnest shows how central the symbolic significance of that number was to the group's self-understanding. They were not simply rebuilding a community. They were restoring a symbolic structure that defined what they believed they were.
So, the structure of 12 was understood as constitutive, not merely numerical.
Yes. Paul of Tarsus, who was not one of the 12, would become arguably the most significant transmitter of the early Christian message, writing letters that became a substantial portion of the New Testament and traveling across the Mediterranean world. His relationship to the apostolic group was complicated. He had not known Jesus during his lifetime. He had persecuted the early community before his conversion, and his theological interpretations sometimes conflicted with those of Peter and the Jerusalem church. The tension between apostolic authority and the expanding mission created by Paul is one of the earliest internal debates in Christian history.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand the apostles as individual figures with distinct characters and traditions, where would you invite them to continue in?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with the 12 by C. Bernard Ruffin.
So this is a book that takes each apostle seriously as an individual rather than treating them as interchangeable figures in a collective portrait.
Ruffin combines biblical accounts with historical context to present each figure as an individual within the early Christian movement. The book offers insight into their personalities, their missionary activities, and the traditions surrounding their deaths and legacies, while being honest about the limits of what can be known with certainty.
Is it accessible to readers without a background in biblical studies or early Christian history?
Ruffin writes for a general audience and builds his own context carefully. No specialist background is required. The book is organized by apostle, which means a reader can engage with individual figures selectively rather than having to read the whole work before encountering the figures they are most interested in.
Zoe gives the reader both the historical and the traditional dimensions of each figure.
Precisely, and Ruffin approaches the subject with genuine respect for both the historical questions and the religious tradition, which makes the book useful for readers coming from either direction.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
After the crucifixion, the remaining 11 gathered in fear, uncertain what had happened and what it meant. The accounts of what came next, the resurrection appearances, the commissioning to go and make disciples of all nations, and the event called Pentecost in which they received the Holy Spirit, are theological claims that cannot be verified historic. What can be said historically is that this group of frightened individuals within a generation had spread their message across the Roman Empire in ways that had no precedent. The missionary journeys of the apostles, as recorded in tradition, took them across an extraordinary geographic range. Peter went to Rome, where tradition says he was executed under Nero, crucified upside down at his own request, because he considered himself unworthy to be executed, in the same manner as Jesus. Andrew went to Greece, and possibly to the territory that is now Scotland, Ukraine, and Russia. Thomas, according to a tradition that is taken seriously by Christians in India, traveled to the subcontinent and established communities there that still exist. Philip went to what is now Turkey. James the Greater went to Spain and is venerated at Santiago de Compostela.
So within a generation, the movement had reached the edges of the known world.
Yes, most of the apostles are said to have been executed for their faith. The traditions describe crucifixions, beheadings, being stabbed, being stoned, being flayed, and being burned. The specific details vary in reliability, but the pattern is consistent. The movement they founded was sufficiently threatening to established order that its primary teachers were systematically targeted. This context of persecution is essential for understanding the intensity of commitment the early Christian communities developed. The broader legacy of the apostolic group is one of the most consequential in world history. The movement they transmitted became Christianity, which at the time of writing has approximately 2.5 billion adherents and has shaped law, art, philosophy, politics and culture across most of the world for nearly 2 millennia. This outcome was not obvious or inevitable from the perspective of first-century Judea, where a small group of followers of an executed provincial teacher began meeting in private homes to share a meal and a message.
So what began in a specific time and place became one of the defining forces in the shaping of human civilization.
Yes, and the apostles themselves as individuals were not the explanation for this outcome. Each of them was limited, fallible, and operating in conditions of real danger with incomplete understanding of what they were doing. What they shared was a commitment that persisted through failure, fear, and the constant possibility that everything they were doing was futile. Peter's phrase, "Lord, to whom shall we go?" captures this precisely. It is not a declaration of triumph. It is a statement of remaining, of continuing, in the face of all the reasons not to. The modern relevance of their story is not primarily theological for those who do not share the faith. It is a story about what ordinary people can accomplish when they commit fully to something that matters to them. The apostles had no institutional power, no wealth, no military force, and no political patronage. What they had was the conviction that what they had experienced was worth transmitting at any cost. That combination of ordinariness and extraordinary commitment is not unique to them in history, but it is rarely so clearly documented.
So the apostolic story is also a general story about how movements begin, sustain themselves, and eventually transform the world they started and in.
Yes, and what makes the 12 specifically compelling as historical figures is precisely the visibility of their human limitation. They are not presented as perfect. Peter denied, Thomas doubted, James and John competed for status, Judas betrayed. These are people whose failures are as well documented as their commitments. And yet from this group, with all its contradictions and inadequacies, came the transmission of a message that reshaped the ancient world and has not stopped shaping the modern one.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through 12 individual lives, 12 distinct personalities, and the long journey from a fishing village in Galilee to the edges of the Roman world.
The apostles remind us that history is not only made by those who hold power, it is made by those who hold on, even when holding on seems unreasonable, even when they cannot see where it leads.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.